This is BBC News, the headlines. A rubber boat taking migrants across the Channel from France to England has sunk off the French coast, killing 8 people. 45 migrants have now died in the Channel this year. Exceptionally heavy rain is still lashing parts of Central and Eastern Europe and has killed at least 5 people in Romania and 1 each in Austria and Poland. Israel's Prime Minister warns the Houthis in Yemen of a heavy price after a ballistic missile managed to enter Israeli airspace. The missile, launched from Yemen, fell in an open area. The Houthis said their attack was only the beginning. A successful end to the Polaris Dawn mission, whose 4-member team on Thursday completed the first ever commercial spacewalk. The SpaceX Dragon capsule safely splashed down off the coast of Florida. You're watching BBC News. Now on BBC News, Newscast.
Yesterday, Laura, you were telling me and the one listener to the podcast that
as many as that.
It's just got really real for Labour.
Yeah, I think so. And that was a kind of sense from having conversations with people, you know, towards the end of last week for a variety of different reasons. And I think then this morning, you look at all of the headlines, all difficult things, all issues with not obvious solutions. And I think that is absolutely the case. So the stories around, there's tons of them in there.
Yes, there's Labour donors and dresses for Lady Starmer. There's the UEFA story weighing in about an independent regulator for football. There's the missiles going into Russia story.
There's a horrible, tragic story this morning. 8 confirmed deaths already from a migrant crossing across the Channel.
So we're going to try and tackle the news in this episode of Newscast, what the best guests on the broadcast airwaves have said about them, and we'll be joined by the fabulous Nick Watt.
Newscast. Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Laura in the studio.
It's Paddy in the studio.
And Nick Watt.
Very nice to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
So a very, very newsy day, and none of them really none of them easy things for the government. Let's start with the news early this morning that as many as 8 people, or at least 8 people, have been confirmed as having lost their lives as trying to cross the Channel from France across to the south coast of England. The French police have said that this morning and announced it. We asked the politicians in the studio about it this morning. The Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, expressed, sadness and concern, as you would expect. But the timing of this is interesting, isn't it, Nick? Because I think later today or perhaps early tomorrow, Keir Starmer's off to Italy to talk to Giorgia Meloni, who's taken a very strong, her supporters would say, approach on trying to crack down on illegal immigration. And the government do seem open to following some of her example.
That's right. So the Prime Minister had a long conversation with Giorgia Meloni at the European Political Council, the European Political Summit that he hosted. He inherited it from Rishi Sunak, and he hosted that meeting at Blenheim Palace in the summer and had a long chat with Giorgia Meloni. And he's very interested in her ideas. And her ideas, which have led to a reduction in what is now called irregular migration across the Mediterranean to Italy, that is based on 2 big things: going upstream and going downstream. So upstream is you go to the countries where the migrants are coming from, which in the case of Italy is Libya and Tunisia, and you have deals with them, which involves a lot of money to reduce the incentive for people to come to Italy. That seems to be successful. That's the upstream element. The downstream element is that when migrants come to your country, come to Italy, you then process them elsewhere. And so what's happening with Italy is they're being processed in Albania, and Keir Starmer is interested in that. That is different to the Rwanda scheme. Your asylum application is processed in Albania. If you're successful, you go to Italy. If you're not successful, you're returned home. Rwanda was a final destination. No processing. You go there.
Yeah, it's a good distinction, because I was thinking to myself, there's political ammunition there for the critics of the Labour government. And, of course, on Radio 4 today, the world this weekend is addressing the ongoing tightening of border controls in Germany, which, of course, it gives us a sense of a continental problem being addressed by different countries at the same time.
And it's interesting, that's something actually the former government used to have when they were criticised over Rwanda. They would say, hey, look, we're not the only ones doing this. Other people are doing similar things. Now, Nick, you make that really important point. At this stage, no other country is saying, actually, you arrive, if you get here, you're just going to be sent somewhere else, and that is it. But it's true that there is definitely a trend of European leaders taking tougher approaches because of what's going on. And this is what David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, said when we asked him if the government really was considering the kind of model that Italy had been following.
They have a comprehensive scheme with Albania, understanding that Balkans route, as well as the Channel and the southern Mediterranean, are routes with which migrants use. So, of course, because it's reduced the numbers, we are interested in discussing with Italy the schemes that they develop, not just with Albania, but upstream schemes with Syria and Libya as well.
We go through the headlines now, because let's turn away from that to the question of, will Western-supplied missiles head into Russia fired from Ukraine? Now, on Radio 4, we heard many guests tell us this morning that if you supply weaponry, they will end up being used. And this is of great concern to newscasters, this escalation. The meeting between the Prime Minister and the President in Washington gave no public answer. And yet the newspapers and the airwaves are filled with saying someone's going to have to answer this very soon.
It feels that no final decision has been made. I think there was a hope on the UK side that they would get the agreement from the White House. That hasn't happened, but it's not a definitive no. We are all now moved to the UN General Assembly in New York at the end of September. Keir Starmer will be there, Joe Biden will be there, and Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, will be there, where he will be outlining his plan for how this war ends. And it sounds like Joe Biden wants to hear from President Zelensky. But I do think it's really important to say, what are these Storm Shadow missiles intended to do if Ukraine is allowed to fire them into Russia? Are they designed to ensure that Ukraine wins this war? Well, that would be great, but nobody's saying that's going to happen. Are they designed to tilt the balance of this war? That would be great if that happened, would be the view in the UK. That's not going to happen. What they're designed to do is put intense pressure on President Putin, who is facing very, very strong pressure to strengthen President Zelensky's hand if we move towards some sort of negotiations to bring an end to this war.
And this is how the Foreign Secretary answered what sounds like a simple question. Are you going to send these missiles and allow them to be used into Russia or not? So I'm going to say that again, because we are sending these missiles. And this is what David Lammy said in response to what is a simple question. Are you going to give Zelensky permission to use these missiles, firing them into Russia or not? But this is what now our diplomat-in-chief, no longer opposition politician, had to say.
No war is won with any one weapon. That is the case.
But this weapon might make a difference.
And it's important that we support the Ukrainians to continue to repel Russia in the Black Sea. It's important that they can deal with the huge challenges in the air that are being mounted by Russia, and of course that we support them, and we have, with training of their own men and women on the front line. 45,000 we've trained, more than I think any other nation.
And there's no dispute about the fact that there has been a lot of help.
No one weapon wins any war and has won any war.
What's interesting, though, about this, Nick and Paddy, is that there is a pattern that you can clearly see. President Zelensky says to his Western allies, yes, I love that you've been backing me, but I need more. This. Tanks it was. Months and months and months and months and months. Eventually tanks go. Then there was the question of fighter jets. I need fighter jets. Months and months and months and months. Then eventually fighter jets. Now, a very senior former military man, General John McCall, former Deputy Supreme Allied Commander of Europe at NATO, what a fabulous title, told us this morning that he thinks in the end they will allow this to take place. But you can see the frustration in Ukraine is that they ask and ask and ask and ask, and there is delay, perhaps for very good reasons. The censor in the government here and across the Atlantic is they need to understand exactly what the impact of these missiles might be if they were used in that way, except while political and diplomatic wheels turn slowly, of course, every day there's loss of life on the Ukrainian and the Russian side. And there's this sense that General McCall was alluding to, that the West is doing enough to allow Ukraine to keep fighting. They're not doing enough to allow it to actually to win this war. And therefore, it goes on. It's a stalemate. And that is something that when Western leaders say, well, they can have everything he needs to win, that's actually not what the evidence tells us. That's not the pattern of how this has developed in the last couple of years.
And Piers Morgan punctured through that by saying there's a very simple question. who do you want to win this war? Or more importantly, who do you not want to lose this war? And if the view is in the West, and it is the view that they want Ukraine to win this war, but that's not probably going to happen, but they'd like Ukraine not to lose this war, then you do need to give them what they need. But there is immense caution because of the potentially escalatory nature of allowing these sorts of weapons. And also, I think the components, the intelligence that is required for the use of these weapons are at a NATO level. And so it's not that you need everybody in NATO agreeing, but clearly President Biden will be very, very concerned about what Germany thinks. And Germany is getting very, very nervous because Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany, is facing intense political pressure on his hard right and on his far left. And the one thing that those two political forces on either side of the spectrum have in common is they want a much softer approach for Germany's relations with Russia.
And Piers Morgan was on our panel this morning expressing that view, like essentially you've got to pick a side here. But it is more complicated than that in a set. You know, you've got these two things. Yes, there is. If you want to take the Boris Johnson or the Piers Morgan view of this is a conflict between good and evil and you have to pick a side. And I'm paraphrasing there. But it's interesting, Paddy, isn't it, how much foreign affairs is right at the top of the agenda of a new Prime Minister.
And here's the thing, the US election changes the compass bearings on this discussion that we're now having, because it's in the papers today, the Sunday paper, a lot of analysis. Putin can see a very big difference between a White House run by Kamala Harris and a White House run by Donald Trump. This is of very great interest to me because David Lammy, our Foreign Secretary, in a previous role as a chirpy chappy on the back benches, was terribly rude about Donald Trump, wasn't he? I mean,
and more than that, I mean, highly, highly, highly critical, calling him a woman-hating, neo-Nazi sympathising sociopath. Now, that's not kind of standard political bants. People would say that how Donald Trump behaves, and particularly the kinds of things he said this week. Nick looks positively flabbergasted.
No, he has. But what is interesting is that David Lammy has spent the last 18 months trying to get pretty close to the Donald Trump team.
Despite that?
Oh, yeah, and I interviewed a guy called Eldridge Colby, who is being talked about as a possible national security advisor if we have Trump 2 presidency. And he's been talking quite favourably about David Lammy and quite like that David Lammy has talked about how Donald Trump correctly called on European powers to spend more on NATO, which was a big Donald Trump thing. So David Lammy has made a huge effort with the Trump team. And in one of those meetings where he was meeting the Trump team saying, you know, I just better mention what I've said, one of the members of the Trump team said to him in this meeting, oh, we've all said much worse about that than Donald Trump. Don't worry. But there are other people in the Trump circle who have not forgotten and will not forgive what David Lammy said.
And it's a very interesting question. How would that play out if Trump does end up back in the White House? Because the UK Foreign Secretary has to be able to have a proper relationship with the White House. If the White House shuts the door to him, then the State Department isn't going to talk to him. And there are some people that go around the place, you know, I've seen politicians that said to me, well, actually, if Trump wins, then like they'll have to fire Lamy. I mean, and it's interesting. You can see that he has been moderating his approach. He's friends with J.D. Vance, which is interesting. He's made that point, Donald Trump's vice presidential candidate. But it's also just fascinating from a kind of human point of view, actually, to see how these people who are outspoken in opposition are now talking in completely different ways. And David Lammy this morning even refused to comment on Donald Trump's untruths this week about immigrants in Springfield in Ohio, his claims that Haitians were eating people's pets, baseless claims that have also, I mean, this is not a joke, there have been bomb threats to schools around Haitians in Springfield. There has been genuine upset and serious events as a result of those comments. And David Lammy just would not touch it with a barge pole. And I do think there'll be people who have been watching that at home, whether they're Labour voters or not, who will be struck by that.
David Lammy does have one big thing in common with J.D. Vance, which is they have both been spectacularly rude about Donald Trump. But the worry, as you say, in sort of UK diplomatic circles is that you've seen a precedent of this, which is when Kim Darroch, now Lord Darroch, had to resign as British ambassador after there was a cable that was leaked, a telegram, in which he'd written some very disobliging things about Donald Trump. When the UK embassy heard about this, they were straight on the phone to the White House, spoke to the chief of staff. The view was, oh, don't worry, it'll all be fine. And then a few days later, Donald Trump came out and said, we will not be dealing with that man. And that was the end of Kim Darroch as ambassador in Washington. The worry is that all officially in the Trump circle, they say, that's fine, David Lammy, we've said that sort of thing, don't worry. And then Trump stands up and says, we will not be dealing with that man.
Well, and that's the thing, is the unpredictability, right, of a potential Trump too. And that was what General McCall, formerly of NATO, he said, actually, look, when it comes to NATO, Donald Trump actually had a positive effect in some ways. And that sort of narrative that it was all dreadful and he was all a negative force is not right. But when I asked him who, as a military guy, he would prefer as commander-in-chief, of course, he was very diplomatic and actually didn't name names, but it was clear who he meant. He did not mean Donald Trump, and his point was about reliability and predictability. And he said, as a commander-in-chief, you want somebody who is reliable, who you know that you can predict their behaviour. I'm paraphrasing slightly, but that is the great unknown. You know, Trump too, if it comes to pass, might be more predictable, might be a different kind of guy. Or it might be that you go back to an era where every morning, every politician, every journalist, lots of American citizens would wake up and you nervously look at your mobile phone and think, what has he tweeted overnight that could change the world in a flash?
So that's some of the foreign affairs. There was another issue today which we're going to touch on, which is, of all things, a row about football. So the past government said it would be good to have an independent regulator. That came out of the Stucci over a Super League. And the Union of European Football Associations, UEFA, has sent a letter, which the BBC's seen, to the current government, which backs the proposal anyway, and reintroduced it, warning that England, which is due to host the Euros in 2028, can't compete in its own hosted event because it looks like government interference.
It's terribly messy, isn't it?
Have I even gone there in explaining this?
I think you've explained it really well. This morning at 5, when I was looking, you're thinking, I'm not quite sure I understand this story correctly, but I think you've explained it really well. I would also applaud your use of the word Stucci, because yesterday you used Stramash, so that's just doing it for me today to have that 2 days in a row.
Here's what the sports writer Henry Winter said, who knows what he's talking about. Here it is, talking on Radio 4 this morning.
There's absolutely no chance that England will A, have the games taken away from them, and B, won't be allowed to get involved, because English football is a very good organiser. They're a financial powerhouse. UEFA also know quietly that they need an independent football regulator to stand up to the major clubs, which don't only threaten English football if they have their way and start moving games around the world, but they also threaten UEFA.
So Henry's basically telling us this is probably a scare story, but it's a very interesting letter because it has been sent. We telephoned the former Conservative Sports Minister, Tracy Crouch, who told us, I had plenty of conversations with UEFA about this. They didn't have any problem with it back then. So there we leave it, because otherwise you're going to be testing me again, and I don't want to be tested any further.
On football knowledge?
On football knowledge.
No, but I'd also be too petrified that you might start doing it back, and that would be embarrassing for both of us.
I bet Nick knows.
Well, I heard a fascinating fact over the weekend.
What was that?
That there is only one Conservative-held constituency that has an English league football team.
Well, you see, I pompously said, and I'll sound even more pompous today, has anybody noticed that Keir Starmer keeps having events at non-league football matches or at non-league football grounds or lower league football grounds? And yes, he is a genuine football fan, but isn't it interesting? And actually, I've been told that that's a very deliberate part of their strategy, because you can map over those towns with the kinds of constituencies they like to win. Some people suggested that I was appalling and terribly cynical for suggesting that, which was, as it happens, entirely true. It just has to be said. But there we go. It worked.
Well, which team it is.
Well, the thing is...
And then who told me? The clever person.
No, I'm sorry to interrupt there, because, I was going to say that there is on the Venn diagram of what I think politics matters to the general listener is authenticity.
Yeah.
And if Keir Starmer is genuinely a football fan...
He is genuinely a
he turns up with good outcomes politically and football-wise at non-league football grounds. It's an authentic Keir Starmer, and I think what all of us as voters and journalists say, it really works very well when there's a straight line between what you actually think and what you actually do.
And who'd have thought it, as Piers Morgan so shyly shared with the nation this morning, that he and the Prime Minister are both going to the football today, as is David Lammy, I think, because there is a certain North London derby, at which point I won't say any more because I'll then start talking about things that I don't know
I got
about.
into terrible trouble on Newsnight when I said during the general election campaign that Keir Starmer is the first genuine football fan of Prime Minister since Gordon Brown. And everyone said, that's outrageous. Rishi Sunak supports Southampton. Now, I'm a great non-expert in football, which means I can always recognise an expert. And my definition of an true expert on football is if you said to Keir Starmer, supports Arsenal, looking back over the last 40 years, what would you say were the 20 most important games? You can guarantee that he would speak non-stop for 4 hours. And the only last Prime Minister you could do that with is Gordon Brown about Wraith Rovers. And you literally have seen Gordon Brown talking on TV for hour upon hour about Wraith Rovers. But shall I tell you about the only constituency that is Conservative hell amongst the 92 league football clubs? It is Bromley.
Yes.
And who is the source of that, which means it obviously is true, is the great and wonderful Nigel Morris, former independent political journalist who is one of the greatest experts on football. He's actually my football tutor, a task in which he says he has consistently failed because I'm consistently hopeless. But there we are. But I'm interested.
Actual real football or football trivia?
Football trivia, yeah.
OK, so he hasn't been teaching you how to take penalties?
No, my son's doing that. And again, I'm failing on that count.
Yeah, but I mean, because it's interesting. I mean, this is a Sunday edition of Newscast.
Yes.
And the conversation about football is very grabby. Yeah. And I would make a prediction that if you look later today at the number 1 or number 2 most read story on the BBC website and our rivals, who also host very good websites, it will be the football story, which the top line of which is England may not be allowed to compete at the Euros, which it's actually hosting. The public are going to read that. And I go back to saying the Prime Minister understands football, loves to talk about football. Therefore, when you put the two things together, and we're at it now, that's exactly how the national conversation works.
And he can remember which football team he supports. Unlike David Cameron.
I tell you another story that I think is going to get a lot of people's attention, and it got quite a lot of our viewers' attention this morning, and I have some rather angry emails in my inbox about the saga. Well, actually, it's not a saga yet because it's not even 24 hours old, this story, but I predict it may become a saga of Lady Starmer's frocks. So the Sunday Times found the story that Keir Starmer had to declare late or later than he ought to have done donations to his wife from the wealthy megabucks donor, Lord Alli, who has been a Labour donor for a long, long time, but who also donated to Mr. Starmer himself, who spent the money on things like new glasses, outfits, accommodation. Thousands of pounds of accommodation were given to the couple. And the story is that personal shopping, alterations and clothes were paid for by Lord Alli, and that there was a problem with how the declarations were done, which Labour says it's now corrected.
A problem of timing, isn't it?
Problem of timing, exactly. So there is no suggestion that this was some great egregious crime, but it is politically very awkward, partly because it's a story that's really easy to understand. Like someone got free frocks. What's that all about? Because that's not normal to most of us. That doesn't happen. It's some of the bizarre things about politics that wealthy donors give lots of money to prominent politicians. That's not, that's
funnily enough, football tickets in football boxes.
And Taylor Swift tickets, all these sorts of things. And all, lots of politicians do this. But second of all, it's awkward because Labour made so much mileage, unsurprisingly, out of all of the Tory misdemeanours, donors doing dodgy things, all these allegations of cronyisms. And I reckon that the saga of donors and dresses will become a saga.
I mean, it's interesting because David Lammy was obviously talking about it on your programme, and the point he was making is that it's not that Keir Starmer was hiding this and he got found out. They hadn't declared it within the correct time frame, which is 28 days. They were then looking over, I think, when they saying that there were some offers of sort of free stuff coming into Victoria Starmer. And so they contacted the parliamentary authorities and said, what do you think about this? And they said, declare it. So a declaration has been made, and it's a late declaration. And a late declaration, is like a bad thing. But as you say, Laura, the problem for Keir Starmer is that he held the Conservatives to an incredibly high moral standard. I mean, Keir Starmer was repulsed by Boris Johnson. That's no secret. He thought that morality and Boris Johnson were two concepts that never went together. And if you hold people so publicly and relentlessly to such an incredibly high moral standard, if there are questions about your conduct and there may be a perfectly innocent explanation, then you are going to find yourself under a lot of political pressure.
But here's just a taste. There was an email from one viewer, and we had quite a lot on this subject. I hope that they'll be able to buy your wife a new dress for the conference this week, not rely on a donee. Please remember, we who don't have a pension credit but are on a limited income have to face every single expense. I have to have a discussion with myself about whether I can afford a new winter coat.
Right. So two things are going on here for me listening to this. You're showing me the incandescent nature of this as a story, which will get into all the tabloids and we'll all understand it. And the other thing about it for me is that it's not comparable, is it? Partygate and a late declared dress. So it's probably not fair. But on the other hand, it's totally grabbable and understandable and doorsteppable that a free dress has gone over there when you're at the same time cutting pensioners from the universal winter payment allowance, winter fuel allowance, which takes us back to the very beginning of this episode, which was quite a long time ago, when we said all this is get real time. It's the list of events from foreign affairs through, of all things, a UEFA decision, a letter, which would be normal on its own, a dress, and the international global crisis. Welcome to number 10 Downing Street.
Governing's hard, eh?
I've never tried, and no one would ever let me.
I would let you, Paddy. I would totally vote for you. Whatever party you were in, whatever you said in your manifesto, I would vote for you.
You poor woman. Nick, that's the point. Will you give us your final closing verdict on the first 50 days, or however long it is now?
Well, I mean, it's been absolutely relentless. They hit the ground running and were seen to have prepared very well.
Was it sore when they hit it?
Yeah. then there were the riots, and Keir Starmer used his experience as the former Director of Public Prosecutions to handle that quite well. And now they are hitting a rough patch because there is a feeling in the Labour Party, and this goes right into the government, that they did not think through the politics of means testing the winter fuel and allowance. And that is the backdrop and the background of why Keir Starmer is finding things really difficult.
Great to have you with us on a Sunday. It's nice to see you, as ever.
I'm sure it's more than 50 days. I've given a shorthand.
10 weeks.
10 weeks.
Yeah.
The key thing is he's passed 49 days. He's been longer than Liz Truss.
And
right.
Longer than a lettuce.
Yeah.
There we are. Lovely to have you with us.
Thank you for turning up on a Sunday on Parade. And from this Sunday episode, it's goodbye.
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 Newscast from the BBC.